Badaoui ROUHBAN for joining the DR Pioneer interview. We have worked a long time ago together in the 1980s, but I would like to know even before then, how did you initially get engaged in DRR work?
I joined UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. I joined UNESCO in 1980 as an earthquake engineer and as a specialist in earthquake and seismology. And I discovered when I joined UNESCO that the organization is mandated by our governing bodies, but also by the United Nations as a whole, is mandated to study the natural hazards, but also to help promote, on the basis of these studies, to help promote ways of minimizing the risk stemming from this kind of hazard. So I was lucky to realize that there is in UNESCO a boulevard, an avenue to start contributing to this fantastic field. And in 1980 and in the early 1980s, UNESCO work was essentially threefold: to help member states, to help countries which are members of UNESCO, to help them get the capacity to observe and to monitor earthquake risk, seismicity, seismic risk, but also to help these countries to have engineers, technicians who are able to design structures and buildings which are capable of withstanding the earthquake risk. So this was one pillar of UNESCO activity. Another pillar of UNESCO activity was to sensitize policy makers, to sensitize officials in our member states on the danger of natural hazards, including earthquake. So gradually in the 80s, my work was to, on one side, keep in touch with the seismological, scientific, earthquake engineering community, but also at the same time, nurture ties with policymakers, with decision makers, with the society in our member states, with the civil society, with the academic society, in order to build this sensitivation on the issue, and in order to build networks on the national level, networks on the regional level, but also on the international level. So again, I was lucky because this field was new in a way to UNESCO. Although I will speak about it later, although the mandate entrusted to UNESCO does not date back and cannot be traced back only to the 80s, but also to the 60s and 70s. Because, and I will end here, because UNESCO was given by the United Nations Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, in 1960. So as early as 1960, UNESCO was given by the ECOSOC through the Secretary General of the United Nations the mission to start exploring and investigating on the regional level, on the 5 geographical regions: Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, Balkan, Northern America, to investigate what is the status of seismic risk, how these countries in these 5 geographical regions are handling earthquake observation, How are they coping with what we call the earthquake resistant structure and buildings? And how are they dealing with the education in this field? So UNESCO started this survey in the 1960s, as early as the 1960s. And on the basis of this survey, which lasted 4 years, UNESCO convened in 1964 the first intergovernmental meeting as ever, the first intergovernmental meeting in the world on the issue of earthquake risk. So this was in 1964. From 1964 to 1976, so during 12 years, UNESCO started to develop further its program on earthquake, of course, earthquake risk, but also extended it to volcanic eruption risk, to landslide risk, to the flood risk in cooperation with WMO, World Meteorological Organization, but also to drought and desertification in cooperation with other United Nations agencies specialized like UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, like FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, etc., etc. So UNESCO in the 80s, when I discovered the organization, UNESCO was building on its previous record in the 60s and 70s, and in the 80s was in the full range of developing its program. That's how UNESCO entered in 1985-86 in the nice adventure of what we call the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, IDNDR. So the concept of IDNDR started in 1985. It evolved from 1985 up to 1989 when the IDNDR was proclaimed. But when UNESCO entered this nice adventure, it was already well armed and it was already having some good operational mechanism which enabled it to be really among the front runners and among the major actors in the creation and the establishment of the IDNDR. And if I may mention, I was also lucky and I was honored when the concept of the IDNDR was launched in 1984 by Dr. Frank Press. 1984, Dr. Frank Press, the then president of the United States National Academy of Science, gave a keynote speech in 1984 in San Francisco in front of the World Conference of Earthquake Engineering, and he announced, Dr. Frank Press announced the concept of the IDNDR in that speech. He said, with the scientific knowledge that we have now in 1984, with the technological know-how, with the advances of satellite science, etc., time is ripe to start a new adventure. He called it International Decade on Natural Hazard Reduction. But the concept evolved to become in 1989 under the umbrella of the United Nations General Assembly to become in 1989 the proclamation of the International Decade on Natural Disaster Reduction, IDNDR. In 1999, when the IDNDR finished, the United Nations proclaimed a successor, which was the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, UNISDR, the acronym.
Mm-hmm. And you were part of all these different evolutions and developments from the very beginning, and working for an organization within the UN system, which was already a pioneer. And you were then like a pioneer within this organization. But what were your personal major achievements in those early days before 2000? Were you mainly or only focusing on earthquake risk, or did you expand also your activities to other hazards? And what were the challenges that you faced during that time?
Once more, I was lucky and honored to have witnessed all this period, starting 1980 up to 2013. So in my professional life, I am honored and privileged to have accompanied a process on the global level, a process of almost 35 years, almost. A process which saw the concept of, first of all, understanding the hazards, understanding the risks, evaluating vulnerability and risk, tackling the issue from a multi-hazard perspective, not only by silo on earthquake, volcanic eruptions, landslides, floods, drought, but to have an approach, a new paradigm where you would tackle all these dangers in a multi-hazard and multi-sectoral way. And the chance which I personally have, and those working in UNESCO together, my colleagues and myself with me, the chance that we have, the luck that we have was that UNESCO, by its mandate, by its nature, is a multidisciplinary organization, as opposed to other United Nations institutions and agencies. But UNESCO has education, has social sciences, has natural and environmental sciences, has communication and information, and has culture and education. So, you know, from these 5 angles in UNESCO, you could discover and you could see, as a newcomer like me, I could see all the ingredients and I could test these ingredients which contribute to the understanding of natural hazard, but also to mitigate these hazards and risks stemming from them through science, social science, education, communication, information, and culture. So my achievement, you asked me about my achievement was to further this in UNESCO, to further promote this multidisciplinary approach in UNESCO, not only within the Secretariat, but also at the level of the platforms where we are needed. Which are these platforms? These platforms are our member states, the countries, our partners like the scientific community, the educational community, but also the civil society. So when you nurture in UNESCO the need for a multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral and multi-hazard approach, you have also to apply this at the level of the country, at the level of the nation, at the national level, but also at the level of the actors like civil society. So you have to translate and to transpose what you are experiencing on a daily basis in your office in Paris. You have to translate it and to transpose it to the countries where you are operating as well.
But UNESCO, I mean, because of its broad mandate, it's certainly an advantage. It can deal with all these topics, but there may also be some challenges because, as you said, you're entering also some mandates of other UN agencies. You have to deal with multi-stakeholder approaches with different interests. So you need a lot of diplomatic skills and a lot of collaboration efforts to work closely with all these different agencies and these different stakeholders. And was this part of your role also?
You know, officials, staff members in UNESCO Secretariat, but also staff members in WMO Secretariat or WHO Secretariat, or the staff members in the United Nations organization in New York, they have, first of all, to make sure that they have the competence on the academic level that is called from them. You know, if you are working in earthquake risk, you have to have knowledge of seismology and earthquake engineering. You cannot be an actor in understanding earthquake risk if you do not have some academic knowledge. I was lucky to have this academic knowledge, but as you said, being an official in a United Nations agency, it is not sufficient that you have a good, strong academic background. This is not enough. You need to remember and to keep in mind that you are also a civil servant, that you are also, you have to accept that you are a bureaucrat, and you have to take from the bureaucracy the good side of the bureaucracy. What is the good side of bureaucracy? Good side of bureaucracy is, as you said, to try to be as much aware that you have the capacity to convince, to explain, and to convey the message. You have to be a diplomat. You have to be a diplomat, of course. You have to acquire still skills of diplomacy. Maybe when I joined UNESCO in 1980, I did not have, certainly not, I was not a diplomat. But I had to realize that diplomacy is an arm in these platforms like UNESCO, in the international landscape. You need also to be a listener. You need also, you are acting on a daily basis with officials, ministers, sub-ministers, ambassadors, diplomats. You have to understand and to be listening to them more than in a way behaving as if you have the knowledge and they don't have it. It is often the opposite. They certainly know the country, the national conditions, much more than a staff member staying in Paris or in Geneva or in Nairobi or in Jakarta. You need to realize that if you are to have efficiency at the national level as a representative of UNESCO, you need first of all to build this partnership with your counterparts who are located at the level of the terrain, at the field level. They know more than you do. They know the conditions. So you have to build on their knowledge, on their experience, and team up with them in this approach. And of course, there are obstacles, as you said. You know, even in any secretariat of any organization, you have the sense of ownership which you have sometimes to grapple with. For example, in UNESCO, we have sectors. We have science sector, we have social science sector, we have education sector, we have culture sector, we have communication. So it is not easy on a daily basis to have people work together on a transversal way among these sectors. Everybody, you know, want to have his own or her own terrain, her own silo. So working in silo is the everlasting danger in any organization. 40 years ago, over the last 40 years, but also today and tomorrow. These silos exist. You have to make permeability. You have to be soft, and you have also to try to operationalize this kind of transversal work at the level of the country, at the level of the town where you are operating in your member state. So the danger, the risk of isolation in silo exists not only in any United Nation or any international organization, but it also exists in the countries. Ministries do not work together, unfortunately, sometimes. If you are talking about natural hazard, you know, you need to have in an organization like UNESCO, education, science, and culture working together. But you need also in a country, you need to have the Ministry of Environment working with the Ministry of Public Work, working with the Ministry of Health, working with the Ministry of Agriculture, all together in a horizontal and transversal way. But if you create within the UN system what we call sometimes the interagency task force on climate change, or the interagency task force on disaster risk reduction, or the interagency task force on now the COVID, whatever. Within this task force, if you create the sense of ownership, but also if you create the sense that each agency can still observe its own mandate, but it also has interest and it will find benefit and it will find added value for it if it were to collaborate and to work together with other UN agencies. You know, I always used to say to our colleagues in Geneva, in the Secretariat of the IDNDR, but also to the Secretariat of the UN ISDR, and today to the Secretariat of ENDRR. I used to tell them, when you will contribute to have a strong UNESCO, a strong WMO, a strong WHO, a strong UNDP, a strong UNEP, when you do not, you know, compete, but on the contrary, you make strong agency in their mandate, you will also become strong. And also I tell myself, I used to tell UNESCO colleagues, look, if you make the coordinating body in Geneva, which is UNISDR body or UNDRR secretary, if you make them strong, then UNESCO will also become strong in the field of natural hazards. That's the message, and that's the reality. So the competition, when it is badly viewed, is a very big danger. And this danger weaken not only your so-called adversary, if you are talking about another UN agency as an adversary, you will be weakening yourself. And that's my message to the future in climate change. The future of contribution to climate change issue, which is certainly, I am sure, is going to be the paramount, the primary issue in the next 10, 20 years. If you know, if we do not work all together, United Nations agencies, but United Nations agency together with the NGO. I kept now speaking for half an hour about the UN system, but this is also valid for the NGO. The NGOs are our sisters and brothers in the United Nations. We should look at them in equal footing. We should not look at the NGO as they have a mandate which is not as important as ours. No, not at all. Each mandate is important in this battle. Each mandate has its intrinsic added value, and we cannot in the future, the multi-actor, multi-stakeholder approaches is going to impose itself on every level.
Okay, this is a very valuable lesson learned. And you said that you had already worked for almost 40 years now in the field. Which were the main lessons and insights learned in these early days that you still think are very relevant today? I mean, there's a lot of things that are being reinvented, but there's also a lot to learn from the past. And from your personal experience, which were the main lessons learned that you think could still be very applicable up to today?
The main lesson which I learned, well, if you allow me, I would like to refer to two lessons. Let me, first lesson is that whether you are in the UN system or whether you are working on a global level, you know, one individual, which I would like to name a champion, one individual, one person sitting in his or her office is capable, has the potential to initiate something which may become at the global level a success story. And if I may say something here, if we are talking, because we are talking about DRR, we are talking about disaster risk reduction. The today enriching experience which all the stakeholders working in DRR are going through and are experiencing, the marvelous DRR experience that we are all going through now, can be attributed without exaggeration to one individual, one person, that is Dr. Frank Press. Dr. Frank Press, academically speaking, was a seismologist. Before becoming advisor to the White House in the 70s and 80s, before becoming president of the US National Academy of Science, he was a seismologist. He was a very successful and known seismologist. But he was the initiator of the IDNDR, of the concept of disaster risk reduction, and we can say that he was behind the ISDR and DRR. So he launched an idea like this in 1984 in San Francisco. He launched an idea which 40 years after became a needed truth, a needed issue, and a horse of battle which we need, which is the battle against the natural hazards and the growing vulnerability to disaster risk. So this is a champion. And the lesson that I learned is that if you are convinced of something, and if you are able to convey the message and to take your pilgrim stick and drive it to the United Nations and to the international landscape, you can become an initiator of something big that the world needs. My second lesson, Bruno, is that however you are competent in your office, or whatever you have academic background or competence or efficiency, this is very much needed. This is very much valuable, and we need it, of course. But to achieve things in life, to achieve this on the global level now, you need to have a political will. You need to generate, you need to contribute to nurture the birth of political will, not only at the level of countries, but at the level of the globe, at the global level. And to initiate a political will at the global level, you need the United Nations. You need the General Assembly of the United Nations. If we were not lucky and successful in mid-1980 to convey the message of the need for a decade to the United Nations General Assembly, which took the ownership of it, luckily, we could not have generated this momentum at the global level.
Okay. And maybe to conclude the interview, I mean, you mentioned already one of the champions you saw as being very influential, and that was Frank Press. Were there other people who you consider as people that have influenced you and that have guided you in your work over the last 4 decades that you said, without them, I would not have come where I am now? Could you maybe mention a few names?
I was again lucky and honored to have worked with very many persons who marked my life, my professional life, not only in the field of natural disasters, but also in other fields. So really, to name beyond Dr. Frank Press, to name people, I would maybe need 2 hours. But let me, if I may, I would like, yeah, to name one more person whom I didn't meet personally. I didn't work with. You know, we are talking about climate change today. This is the primary issue. We are talking about sustainable development goals. We are talking about sustainable development per se. Let us not forget that the concept of sustainable development started very much earlier than the 90s. Of course, it started in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 during the World Summit, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The concept of sustainable development was applied officially by all member states. But in 1984, the Secretary General of the United Nations, by a decision of the General Assembly, created the World Commission on Environment and Development, WCED. And this commission worked for 4 years to tell us what are the dangers on environment, what are the dangers for development, what are the risks that you are facing. And it was at that time also in 1984, from 1984 to 1988, that the alarm was voiced that climate change is a problem, natural disasters are a problem, pending, are coming, you know. So the report of the World Commission on Environment and Development was a first alarm to humanity and to the United Nations. And we call this alarm, we call it the Brundtland Report. Why we call it the Brundtland Report? Because the commission was chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway. So again, this report, and if I may name, Gro Harlem Brundtland was also a champion behind the concept of sustainable development and the concept of climate change and the concept of these risks which the humanity is facing. And we live today with all these messages. They are with us today. So allow me to pay tribute to Gro Harlem Brundtland as well.
Thank you so much, Badaoui, for this interview. I think you've also been an inspiration for the next generations, and I wish you all the very best in the coming decades in your continuation of DRR and climate work.